We have all been fed a magnificent, glittering lie. A lie so deeply ingrained in the lore of werewolf romances that we have somehow learned to romanticize our own psychological destruction. You know the exact story I am talking about. The ruthless, tyrannical alpha who abuses and shatters his fated mate, only to shed a few pathetic drops of remorseful tears later, whisper a hollow apology, and instantly have all his sins washed away by the inescapable, magical pull of the mate bond. But what if I told you that this bond is not a sanctuary, but a suffocating chain? And what if, today, we take that very chain and shatter it into a million irredeemable pieces? We are not here today to talk about forgiveness, nor are we here to indulge in the fantasy of a toxic lover's redemption. We are here to uncover a brutal yet breathtakingly beautiful truth. The absolute ultimate, most devastating revenge you can inflict upon someone who broke you is not a dagger to the heart, nor is it a lifetime of bitter, screaming hatred. The absolute pinnacle of revenge is pure, unadulterated indifference. Welcome to Wolf King Stories channel. If you are tired of those same old toxic cliches and crave stories that tear down the illusions to reveal the raw, psychological depths of survival, self-worth, and true power, I need you to hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell. Your support is the lifeblood that fuels this channel, giving us the immense motivation to keep bringing you these dark, thought-provoking journeys, so join our pack, and let's dive into the abyss together. It has been exactly 3 agonizingly long, transformative years since Grace Whitmore walked out of the towering iron gates of the Iron Moon Fortress. Try to vividly picture that night in your mind. The biting, unforgiving cold of the north, the heavy silence of a pack that deemed her invisible, and the sharp, clinking sound of her collar, the one bearing the crest of the most formidable werewolf pack in existence, hitting the freezing cobblestone, right at the feet of Alpha King Lucas Ashford. Iron Moon, under Lucas's reign, was a terrifying monument to absolute supremacy. Its walls were black marble, its torches burned with the ferocity of its warriors, and at the center of it all sat a king with an ego so deeply toxic it poisoned the very air he breathed. Grace, his fated mate, was branded by the pack as weak, tragically bland, and entirely disposable. She endured the silent humiliations, the chilling neglect, and the suffocating presence of other women parading around his throne, until the illusion of destiny finally snapped. So, she chose the unthinkable. She left. And how did our invincible Alpha King react to his mate walking away into the deadly, unforgiving wild? He smirked. Let us peel back the dark layers of Lucas's mind during those first few months. He did not chase her. He did not howl into the night in despair. In a brain hardwired by the supreme arrogance of an unchecked alpha, Grace was nothing more than a momentary, insignificant glitch in his perfect world. He possessed the terrifying delusion of a true narcissist, fully convinced that a creature as fragile as her would be chewed up and spat out by the world the second she stepped out of his shadow. He stood before his elders, his voice dripping with absolute condescension, and declared that she would not last 3 months. He promised them that when the brutal winter winds began to howl and starvation clawed at her bones, she would drag herself back to the gates of Iron Moon, weeping, pressing her face against the dirt, and begging for his mercy. In his twisted reality, she had no existence without him. The mate bond was a leash, and he held the only master key. But then, the brutal winter arrived, blanketing the north in ice. The snow eventually melted, spring quietly knocked on the doors of the realm, and the heavy iron gates of the fortress remained perfectly, hauntingly undisturbed. Grace never came back. The crucible of snow and the rebirth of a queen. While the Alpha King sat on his suffocating throne counting the days of her assumed suffering, Grace was busy forging a kingdom of her own from the very ashes of her shattered soul. When she walked away from Iron Moon, she did not step into a void of despair. She stepped into the brutal, agonizing, yet profoundly liberating embrace of reality. The wilderness did not care that she was a rejected mate. The freezing rivers and the predatory shadows of the uncharted north did not mock her lack of a title. They only demanded survival. In those first few weeks, every step was a battle against the psychological conditioning that had convinced her she was nothing without her alpha. Her hands bled, her muscles screamed, and there were nights when the phantom pain of the severed bond threatened to stop her heart entirely. But a miraculous psychological shift occurs when a victim realizes that the monster they feared is no longer in the room. The silence of the forest, once terrifying, became a canvas for her rebirth. She learned to hunt, not for a pack that despised her, but to feed her own gnawing hunger. She learned to fight, not to impress a tyrannical king, but to defend the sacred vessel of her own body. Stripped of the toxic label of mate, Grace discovered the dormant, radiant power within her own bloodline, a latent energy that the oppressive aura of Iron Moon had actively suppressed. She eventually stumbled upon the sanctuary of the Sunfire Valley, a refuge for the broken, the lost, and the exiled. But she did not arrive as a beggar seeking pity. She arrived as a warrior forged in ice. Over 3 years, Grace did not merely heal, she evolved. She rose through the ranks of her new community through sheer, unadulterated merit, her empathy and resilience drawing people to her like moths to a flame. The woman who once kept her head bowed in the obsidian halls of Iron Moon was dead. In her place stood a formidable leader, a woman whose eyes held the calm, terrifying depth of a frozen ocean. She had meticulously rewired her own brain, severing the emotional synapses that tied her worth to Lucas's validation, replacing them with a quiet, unshakable fortress of self-love. As Grace's spirit expanded into the boundless horizon, the invisible tether that once bound them began to rot from the inside out, dragging the invincible Alpha King into a psychological hell of his own making. The hollow throne and the erosion of the alpha ego. For the first year, Lucas Ashford thrived on his own delusions. He paraded his dominance, replaced Grace's physical presence with a revolving door of sycophants and shallow lovers, and laughed at the whispers of his elders. But biology and psychology are ruthless bill collectors, and the debt of a broken mate bond always comes due. It did not happen overnight in a dramatic explosion of regret. It happened in a slow, suffocating creep. It began with the silence. The sprawling halls of the Iron Moon fortress suddenly felt cavernous. The food lost its taste. The victories on the battlefield felt hollow, devoid of the subconscious grounding a mate provides. Lucas began to experience an unprecedented, terrifying phenomenon: insomnia. Whenever he closed his eyes, his hyper-arrogant brain, desperately trying to protect his ego, would conjure images of Grace, but not the Grace he remembered. His subconscious began to plague him with visions of her dead in the snow, a direct consequence of his hubris. The narrative he had spun that she would come crawling back was disintegrating, leaving a gaping void where his absolute certainty used to reside. By the second year, the physical symptoms manifested. His wolf, the beast that thrived on dominance, began to turn inward, pacing restlessly within his psyche, howling for the other half of its soul that he had so carelessly discarded. The arrogance that once shielded him morphed into a toxic, paranoid desperation. He sent out covert tracking parties, desperate to find a trace of her, desperate to prove to himself that he still held the leash. When they returned empty-handed time and time again, the reality of his monumental failure began to crush his chest. The women who tried to touch him were violently rejected by his feral instincts. They were not her. They did not carry the scent of rain and cedar that he had spent years pretending he despised. Lucas was slowly being devoured by the realization that he was not a god. He was a deeply flawed, profoundly insecure man who had destroyed the only unconditional thing the universe had ever offered him. He had spent his entire life believing power was about control over others, only to realize that true powerlessness was sitting on a throne of black marble, completely, utterly alone, haunted by the ghost of a woman he had thrown away. Fate, however, possesses a cruel cinematic sense of irony, ensuring that the paths of the healed and the broken would inevitably intersect at the Grand Equinox Summit. The Equinox Summit and the Shattered Illusion of Reunion, 462 words. The summit was a centuries-old tradition, a neutral ground where the alphas of the continent gathered to forge treaties, negotiate borders, and flaunt their power. Lucas arrived as a shadow of his former glory. He wore the velvet and iron of his station, and his posture was rigidly straight, but to those who knew how to look, the Alpha King was bleeding out internally. His eyes were dark, sunken pits of a man starved of sleep and soul. He walked into the grand obsidian hall of the neutral territory, anticipating the usual tedious politics, entirely unaware that the universe was about to stage the climax of his psychological unmaking. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the delegation from the Sunfire Valley entered. The hall fell into a hushed, reverent silence, and there she was. Lucas felt as though a silver blade had been driven straight up through his ribs, Grace. But it was not the meek gray mouse he had discarded. This woman moved with the lethal, fluid grace of a panther. She was draped in garments of deep emerald and gold, her chin held high, her aura radiating a calm, suffocating authority that commanded the attention of every alpha in the room. The physical shock to Lucas's system was so violent he actually stumbled a step backward. His wolf slammed against the cages of his mind, screaming at him to fall to his knees, to crawl to her, to claim what was his. His heart hammered a desperate, erratic rhythm against his breastbone. In that fleeting, volatile moment, Lucas's deeply ingrained narcissism tried to write a new script. He convinced himself that she was here for him. He imagined the scene. She would see him, her eyes would flare with decades of repressed rage, she would scream, she would slap him, she would curse his name. He craved it. He wanted her hatred, because hatred is a fire. And fire meant there was still a connection. Hate meant she still cared. Hate meant she had spent the last 3 years thinking about him, obsessing over him, wounded by him. He braced himself, marshalling a pathetic, practiced look of deep, soulful remorse, preparing to offer the grand apology that would sweep her back into his arms and cure the rotting sickness in his soul. Yet, as he stepped forward to brace for the storm of her vengeance, he was met with a terrifying stillness that no alpha could ever conquer. The devastation of silence and the triumph of apathy. Lucas closed the distance, the crowd parting around them like water. He stood before her, a towering monument of broken pride, his chest heaving. "Grace," he whispered, a cracked, pathetic sound that carried 3 years of agonizing, internalized torment. He waited for the explosion. He waited for the tears. He waited for the triumphant sneer of a woman who had finally cornered her abuser. But what Grace did next was the most violent, soul-annihilating act of psychological warfare Lucas had ever experienced. She stopped her conversation with a neighboring alpha, turned her head, and simply looked at him. There was no widening of the eyes. There was no sharp intake of breath. There was no flinching. Her eyes, those beautiful, deep eyes that he had once thought were unbearably dull, swept over his face with the mild, polite curiosity one might give a stranger asking for directions. It was a look completely devoid of trauma, devoid of longing, and most terrifyingly of all devoid of anger. "Alpha Lucas." She acknowledged, her voice smooth, steady, and terrifyingly pleasant. The tone was professional, clinical, the kind of tone reserved for a business acquaintance whose name you barely remember. I have looked everywhere for you," he stammered, his regal composure entirely disintegrating. "I was wrong. I was a monster. Please, Grace, the bond. I feel it. I know you feel it. We have to talk." Grace tilted her head slightly, a small, polite smile touching the corners of her lips. It was a smile that did not reach her eyes. "There is nothing to discuss, Alpha. I am here representing the Sunfire Valley for the border treaties. If you have concerns regarding the Western Ridge, my advisors will schedule a time for us to review the documents." Lucas physically recoiled. "Documents? Grace, I am talking about us. I am talking about my soul." And then came the killing blow. Grace looked at him, truly looked at him, and for a fraction of a second, the polite veneer parted to reveal the sheer, unfathomable depths of her healing. "Your soul," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper but echoing like thunder in his mind, "is no longer my burden to bear. Excuse me." She turned away. She did not storm off. She did not cast a lingering glance over her shoulder. She simply walked back to her life, seamlessly resuming her conversation, leaving him standing in the center of the hall, choking on the ashes of his own existence. She had not forgiven him, nor had she condemned him. She had simply forgotten him. In that singular, breathtaking moment, Grace proved the ultimate truth. The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. And as the invincible Alpha King collapsed to his knees in a room full of his peers, entirely ignored by the woman who once would have died for him, the illusion of destiny was finally, permanently broken. Conclusion. The tale of Grace and Alpha Lucas serves as a profound exploration of power, trauma, and the ultimate victory of self-reclamation. At its core, the story dismantles the toxic belief that one's worth is tied to another person's validation. Grace's journey from a discarded mate to a formidable leader in the Sunfire Valley illustrates that genuine healing does not come from seeking revenge or waiting for an abuser's remorse. Instead, it comes from entirely detaching one's identity from the source of pain. She forged her resilience in the crucible of isolation, transforming her profound grief into a quiet, unshakable fortress of self-love. Conversely, Lucas's descent into psychological ruin highlights the fragile nature of an ego built on dominance and hubris. He confused control with power and possession with love. His ultimate punishment was not a dramatic confrontation or a fiery display of Grace's hatred, which would have perversely validated his importance in her life, but rather the devastating realization of his own utter irrelevance to her. By greeting him with clinical apathy, Grace delivered the ultimate psychological blow. She had outgrown him entirely. This narrative concludes that the greatest triumph over past trauma is not found in making the one who hurt you suffer, but in reaching a state of peace where they simply no longer matter. Grace won not by fighting the Alpha King, but by rendering him obsolete in her universe, proving that true sovereignty always begins from within. Profound lesson. The most profound takeaway from this narrative is that the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. Hatred, anger, and holding grudges, while natural initial responses to betrayal, require immense emotional energy and keep you invisibly chained to the person who wronged you. True healing is only achieved when the actions, presence, or absence of the person who broke you no longer dictate your internal peace. Your worth is inherent. It is not something that can be granted or revoked by another person's inability to see your value. Real-life application. In your everyday life, apply this by redirecting the energy you currently spend on resentment, seeking closure, or hoping a toxic person will finally realize their mistake, entirely back into yourself. When someone dismisses or disrespects your value, do not fight to prove your worth to them. Instead, walk away and focus purely on your own growth, goals, and passions. Build your own sanctuary by surrounding yourself with a supportive community that appreciates you for who you are. When you eventually encounter people from your past who hurt you, strive not for a dramatic display of anger or a forced show of success, but for a state of calm, emotional detachment. Understand that your greatest revenge and most powerful step forward is simply living a vibrant, fulfilling life where their opinion of you is no longer relevant. Question for the audience. Do you agree that indifference rather than anger is the ultimate sign that you have truly healed from a past hurt? Please kindly share your thoughts and personal perspectives in the comments section below so everyone can read and learn from each other's experiences. If you found this story and lesson valuable, please hit the subscribe button to support the channel and give us the motivation to create more great content for you.